Kathy Miller was just a young woman with dreams and life ahead of her until she answered a simple wanted ad for a new part-time job, and then she vanished without a trace. This is REDRUM, stories about the true victims of crime. I upload on Mondays and Thursdays, so make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. Just a few months after she had Kathy, Mary had this terrifying dream, and I've got to say, to remember a dream you first had just a month after the birth of your first child, it's got to be memorable. It's got to be extremely shocking in some way, because Mary remembered this and it came back up into conversation over and over again over the following years. So this dream or nightmare was basically that she saw her daughter, and although she was an older version and she looked a little different, she was sure it was her daughter, and she was covered in blood, very clearly hurt, and she was pleading for help. And that is when Mary woke up. And of course, she fobbed it off as just a dream. Of course she would. It was just that, but it always did remain there in her mind, and she'd never forget that. Now, life went on, and eventually Mary had another child, a brother for Kathy, and they moved around a bit, and Mary eventually got divorced from Kathy's dad, and they were living together, just the three of them, Mary, Kathy, and Kathy's brother Kenny. And in the book for this case, it's written by Anne Rule, who, if you are interested in true crime books, she's just amazing. I use her books all the time to help research. Anyway, she talks about how that dream that Mary had all those years ago, it still haunted her. And I know it's a little bit odd to start a case with a dream, but it really does come back in a number of ways in this case. So one day, Kathy goes out. She's a teenager by this time. She's around 15 years old. And she goes out to a swimming lesson. But when she comes home, she storms through the house and she tells her mum that she's a bit freaked out because some guy has just followed her after her swimming lesson. She said that he was in his car and turned whenever she turned. He even followed her to the bus stop. Obviously, her mum was concerned, but with the man long gone by this point, there wasn't a huge amount she could do. She did promise that she'd make sure nothing ever happened, and they could figure out what she was going to do the next time the next swimming lesson came around. She wasn't going to have to deal with this on her own. But before that swimming lesson came around, Kathy's life continued on as normal. And by this time in her teens, she'd met a boy called Mark, who soon became her boyfriend. She and Mark were chatting one day when she mentioned she wanted to try and earn a bit of extra money. She was going to do this on the side while she was still studying at school. She said she was going to try and get a part-time job at a nursing home. And it wasn't long before Kathy found a job advert in the local paper. She scanned the advertisement for a phone number, scribbled it down, and took it to the phone. She called and she waited, listening to the ringtone, but no one answered. But that wasn't going to stop her. The very next day, she called again, and this time someone did pick up. She spoke to the person on the other end for a few minutes before letting them know her phone number and her address. But Mary, she could hear that conversation from the next room, and when she heard Kathy put the phone down, she went in and asked who she was talking to. Kathy explained, but that is when her mum became protective, and honestly, reading the source materials for this case, it's very clear how protective Mary is over Kathy, and just how at every single point in her life, she just wants to protect her, she just wants to look after her. She was concerned. Kathy had just given her address to someone she didn't know, someone she'd never even met. But Kathy tried to reassure her. She was just getting a job. The guy on the phone sounded kind. He sounded totally professional. But even with her telling her mother this, Mary was still worried. Still, what was she going to do? She made a promise not to go, but later that afternoon, Kathy went back on her promise. She met that man. He picked her up in his car, and Kathy's boyfriend Mark didn't see the man himself, but he did see his car. He saw Kathy get into it, and they drove off into the distance. But Kathy never returned home that night. Of course, as soon as Kathy didn't come home like planned, Mary knew something was wrong. She managed to track down the specific job advert that Kathy had called, and Mary dialed that number. But the man who answered it said he never ended up meeting Kathy. He tried, but she just never showed up. Mary called the police and they did look into it. They actually ended up going and speaking with that man who had put out that job advert. He was a man called Harvey Carignan, but he told them the exact same thing. He'd actually never seen Kathy. And then something happened. And we don't see this very often with slightly older cases, but the police really took this seriously. They didn't assume Kathy was a runaway. They did think something had happened, and so they appealed to the public. They released details about Kathy and about her disappearance, and they asked anyone to come forward if they had any information. And it really wasn't long after that someone called Mary's home phone. They just discovered something. They'd come across Kathy's algebra book, another textbook, and importantly, her social security card. They'd just been found on the ground of a car park a little way away from where she'd gone missing. The police obviously went to that area and they did a full search, but other than those things, they didn't find anything else. There was no other sign of Kathy. Now, the two detectives who had been put on Kathy's case, they decided they hadn't come to a dead end, not just yet, and instead, they decided to take a little bit more of a detailed look into this Harvey guy, the one who had originally arranged to meet up with Kathy the day that she disappeared. And they realised that Harvey actually had a pretty colourful criminal past. So Harvey had been born in Fargo, North Dakota. Now, when Harvey arrived as a baby, it might have seemed like a cause for celebration, at least on the surface. Fargo in the late 1920s was the beating heart of North Dakota, a cold, wind-lashed city built on grit and faith and survival. People there worked hard. They minded their neighbours' businesses and they tried not to talk too loudly about things that didn't fit the mould. And that's important because this was a time when women were expected to marry young, raise children, and keep the troubles that they were having, if any, quiet. And so a woman having a baby out of wedlock, it wasn't something that was just frowned upon. It was potentially life-ruining. Harvey's mother was 20 years old. She was unmarried and she was alone. She had no husband, no family support. And in a town like Fargo, that kind of thing didn't go unnoticed. The details of Harvey's earliest days are very vague. I mean, it's been suggested that they are kind of perhaps forgotten on purpose. Also, this is many, many years ago. Obviously, record keeping wasn't the same as it is now. We didn't have social media, emails, even letters were kind of few and far between. So anyway, his mother couldn't or wouldn't keep him. He was handed off to relatives. He was shuffled through different homes and treated more like a burden than a baby. Fargo had its rules, and from day one, Harvey was breaking them just by existing. And so by the time Harvey was 4, his mother had reached breaking point. The cupboards were bare, the bills were just getting more and more. And Harvey actually later said, quote, "Nobody wants me," and tragically, he wasn't wrong. And even his family members who would come in and look after him, or the homes that he was shipped to, they all noticed there was something a little bit different about Harvey. Something wasn't right from the beginning. When he got stressed, his body would literally twitch in these kind of sharp, sudden spasms that almost made him look like he was glitching. His limbs jerked, his face would twist, and there was nothing that he could do to stop it. And then there was the bedwetting. He couldn't seem to outgrow it no matter how hard he tried. Every morning, the sheets were soaked. His mother's frustration grew into fury. She would snap at him, and then one day, she just said, "Right, I am sending you away," which is kind of wild. I don't think it's just for the bedwetting issue. Obviously, this is also back in the 1920s, so there's no real understanding of how to support that or any kind of help available. But it really seems as though Harvey's mother was just not willing to or able to prioritise her children. Well, actually her child, because Harvey had siblings and his mothers seemed to really just want Harvey out. She told her sister that she was going to need to take Harvey because she just couldn't handle him anymore. And just like that, Harvey was shipped out from one home to another, always temporary and always conditional. For a short time, he lived with an aunt and an uncle, but it wasn't long before they kicked him out too. He went back to his mother and then off again, this time to his grandmother's, then to another aunt, and it was this kind of carousel of rejection. And underneath it all, something really dark was festering. Now, we do have information about Harvey's childhood, and it's told from Harvey many years later, so take this with a pinch of salt, but some of it will be true, some of it will be potentially exaggerated or potentially not true, and it's really difficult to kind of understand which bits fall into which category, so I'm just going to give you everything I know. So Harvey later said that when he was a kid, he was abused by a babysitter. She rubbed herself against him and he was confused and frightened and violated. And he was so young, he didn't really have the words to explain that. And it warped his understanding of intimacy and of trust and power. And probably it added a really twisted layer to the way that he would later view women. By his teens, Harvey had started stealing, not for the thrill, not even necessarily for the money. And to be honest, it's hard to know for sure, but it's reported that it was more so because it gave him some tiny shred of control in this world where, as we have heard, he's got nothing, he's got no control at all. But also, on top of this, Harvey very clearly thought that he was smarter than everyone else. I'm quoting here. He once said, "I was always mentally ahead of my companions." He felt superior. He thought he was more aware, more evolved, and also he was deeply resentful. He did not want to connect with people. He wanted to stand apart, and because of that, he really didn't care whether he was liked. He just wanted to be noticed. Eventually, his behaviour and his various guardians' inability to deal with him landed him in reform school. After his mother remarried, her new husband actually did offer to raise Harvey as his own son, like give him a father figure, but his mother refused and just said, no, it's just easier if he goes to this reform school. We don't want him here. And so Harvey was sent away. And this was a place where rules were really strict and punishments were harsh, and there was just no such thing as compassion. Actually, the only version of a reform school that I know of and that I've heard of in the media is a version of one. I'm sure it was very different to this given the time difference, but you may have heard of it. Paris Hilton was sent to a kind of reform school when she was in her teenage years, and I watched a documentary on it, and basically what I got was, yes, it's very strict. The punishments are extremely unforgiving, and there's sort of one way to do things, and if you deviate from that at all, and sometimes even if you don't, you are met with absolute aggression and sometimes violence. And in Harvey's case, this reform school was unforgiving, and because he had this, if you remember I mentioned at the start, he had this like twitching, likely caused by some kind of neurological condition, but that twitching made him stand out, and because of that, he was bullied, he was isolated, and at this school, even the staff would ridicule him. It was a system where really fear was used to control. And so by the time Harvey was 18, this whole system, this whole reform school system had completely shifted him. He was no longer this like frail, nervous boy, and instead he was 6'2" for a start. He weighed 190 pounds, and he was very interested in being in the US Army, and they took him in without hesitation. They shipped him off to Anchorage, Alaska, and it was there in the endless daylight, because Alaska, that Harvey would really begin his reign of terror. It was late 40s, early 50s, whilst Harvey was in Anchorage, that something significant happened. Sunday, 31st of July, 1949, and it was just past 9 p.m. But of course, this is Anchorage, it's summer, and so it's kind of light all the time. And so this man, John Keith, he was walking through a park, he was on his way home, but something stopped him. He heard a sound. He thought maybe it was a kind of cry or a grunt. He couldn't really work it out, but he knew something was wrong. And at first, he brushed it off. He kind of excused it. He was in a park. Maybe people were playing. Something had happened, but it wasn't anything to worry about. And he managed to kind of convince himself of this, but only for a few minutes before he was kind of pulled closer to the sound. And what he saw was a man and a woman lying in the grass. Now, from that distance, it looked almost intimate, but as he got closer, he realised that the woman didn't appear to be moving. He went to ask if she was okay, but then the man who was on the floor stood up suddenly, and he was tall, he was towering, he was intense, and he was furious, and he told him, shouted at him to move on and said, "This doesn't concern you." Now, during that kind of brief conversation, the woman didn't say anything and she still didn't appear to be moving. But John was scared at this point, and so he backed away as quickly as he could. He did arrive home and he was trying to kind of fob this off as like, oh, maybe I was mistaken, or maybe it was just a couple. But he really didn't sleep that night. Something about it felt off, and he kept going over those details in his mind. Why hadn't the woman said anything? Why didn't she ask for help? So the next morning before work, John took a little detour and went through the park, hoping he was wrong, hoping it was nothing and there was nothing there. But when he arrived at that same spot, although the man was gone, the woman was still there. She was still lying in the grass, but this time there was no doubt she was dead. Her body was stiff, her clothes were torn, and her face was, well, he didn't know her, but even if he had, her face would have been unrecognisable. It was swollen, it was bruised, it was crushed from her chin all the way up to the top of her skull. Whoever had done this actually hadn't used a weapon, as much as that seemed impossible the way John was looking at this woman, but the coroner later confirmed it. She was beaten to death with bare fists. The personal, brutal, unrelenting force and violence of using just your fist, it's terrifying, isn't it? The victim was identified as Laura Showalter, age 57. She'd been bludgeoned so violently that investigators first assumed it was done with a hammer or a bat, maybe even an axe, but of course, as we know, it was human hands. Raw force, bare knuckles. There were also signs of attempted rape, but there was no semen recovered. It was clear Laura had fought hard, but she hadn't stood a chance. Police had a vague description of the man thanks to John. They learned that he had a receding hairline, he had a really big build, he was maybe in his early 20s, but this wasn't actually that useful because at the time, Anchorage was a gold rush city. It was full of transient workers, soldiers, and drifters, and so any leads that they had dried up quickly and the case went cold. But this wasn't for long. Because a few months later, still in Anchorage, it's 11 a.m, it's broad daylight, and this woman named Dorcas Callan was approached by a man on the street. He was wearing a uniform, he was clearly drunk, and he was insistent that she come for a ride with him, but Dorcas says no, and he demands again and again, and over she says no, but this man will not take no for an answer. Suddenly, he grabs her. He drags her into a roadside ditch, and then he hits her again and again. And she is screaming, she's fighting, she's literally clawing at him. And somehow, during that, she does actually manage to break free. And the attack has already done damage. She's covered in blood. And so she stumbles through the streets into this nearby tavern and calls police. And this time, she has details. She remembers everything. His uniform, his voice, and most of all, a very specific descriptor. She says about this deep dimple in his chin. And so the police round up 5 men who fit this general description. And when Dorcas sees them, she doesn't hesitate. She points straight to one man, Harvey Carignan. Officers bring John Keith in, the man who saw the figure in the park the night that Laura died. John sees the same thing Dorcas saw. It's him. And so Harvey was arrested right there and then. Now, at first, Harvey said very little. He did actually admit to the attempted assault on Dorcas Callan. Now, that's not because he felt remorse. It's because he figured that the evidence was too strong to deny. He said he'd been drinking, he didn't really remember what happened, he just claimed it all got a little out of hand. But when detectives asked about Laura Showalter, the woman found dead in the park, Harvey just kind of shut down completely. He didn't say any words, there was not a flicker of recognition, literally nothing. The Anchorage police were getting nowhere, and so they brought in this senior interrogator from the US Marshal's office. This guy had a reputation. It wasn't a reputation that you might expect from that kind of time period, 1950s, but instead he was really good at using patience and silence and sort of the early recorded knowledge of strategy, I suppose. And he would use this to get confessions out of men like Harvey. He was calm, friendly even. He was the kind of man that he would sit across from a killer and have a cup of coffee and just kind of be chatting. And before you know it, all of this stuff would come out, all of these confessions. But Harvey wasn't playing ball. He was just not talking. And he insisted that they bring in a Catholic priest. Now, it wasn't unusual for suspects to ask for spiritual guidance, especially when they thought they might die in prison. But Harvey wasn't asking for last rites. He was just stalling. Still, the police said, sure, fine, Harvey, whatever you want, you can have that. They kind of played his game. A priest was brought in, and Harvey said he would confess, but only in writing. No interviews, no questions. He'd do it his way, controlling, alone, quiet, just him, his thoughts and the truth, supposedly. For 2 days, Harvey sat in his cell with pen and paper, scribbling. He would cross things out, write more. He barely ate, barely slept. And the officers kept their distance this entire time. They would check in occasionally on him, but they wanted to give him space because they wanted to get out as much as they possibly could. By Monday morning, the pages were ready. The interrogator sat down and kind of braced himself, ready to read the horror on the page. But what he got was nonsense. Harvey's confession read more like a drunken travel diary more than anything else. It talked about bars he went to, drinks he ordered, people he might have talked to. It was a really disjointed timeline of wandering around Anchorage, and there was no mention, none whatsoever, of Laura. No murder, no remorse, not even a name. Now, when they pressed him, Harvey finally admitted why he had danced around the truth, and he said he was scared. He said he didn't think anyone would actually believe him. He did not want to get the death penalty. But then he started asking questions. Quote, will I be sent to federal prison? Do they let you learn a trade there? Could I finish college while I'm inside? It was suddenly very obvious. Harvey did not see prison as a punishment. To him, it was just another stop, like this new place to reinvent himself. The interrogator then switched gears. He leaned into their shared background. Both men had been raised Catholic, both spent time in orphanages. He spoke gently, urging Harvey to set things right with God. He didn't threaten, he didn't raise his voice, he just waited. And eventually, Harvey cracked. Over the course of more than 30 hours, he wrote a second confession, and this time, it was different. He described how drunk he'd been that night in the park, how Laura looked younger in his alcohol-blurred vision, how he didn't want to know her name, he didn't care who she was, he just wanted her. He admitted trying to force himself on her, and when she said no, when she resisted, something in him snapped, he said. He beat her with his fists again and again until she stopped moving. It was graphic and detailed and utterly chilling. And the interrogator finally knew they had it. It had taken days, but now the case against Harvey was solid. And the trial went without a hitch. Harvey was convicted of murder, and he was sentenced to death. And to say he was shocked was an understatement, not because he thought he was innocent, but because he thought prison was the worst it could get. He genuinely believed that if you killed someone, you got a bunk in a cell with bars, maybe picked up a trade, earned a degree, and then walked out a better man many years later. He never expected a date with the electric chair, so of course, after this, he appealed. And this is where the story takes a bit of a turn. Because that, right, in itself, that half an hour retelling of this case, however long it's been, that is a really, really grim and tragic case in itself, right? And it could have ended there if he was kept in prison, but we've still got a long way to go. So as you will probably guess, there's more to come. Harvey's attorneys argued that the confession he gave should be thrown out. They claimed he only spoke because he believed the interrogator was acting as a priest, a religious figure, not a person in his position of detective. They said that Harvey was emotionally vulnerable and mentally unwell. He was afraid. That's what they said. I mean, big deal, he was afraid. I'm sure Laura was afraid. I'm sure she was terrified and vulnerable, but he made a very clear and brutal decision that night, and now she is dead. Anyway, in a decision that would later haunt the judges involved, the court agreed. The entire confession, 30 hours of writing, detail after gruesome detail, that was ruled inadmissible. And without it, the murder charge collapsed. Harvey was no longer a killer in the eyes of the court, just a man who tried and failed to rape a woman named Dorcas Callan. The murder of Laura Showalter was completely gone from the record, and Harvey didn't just escape the death penalty, he escaped justice altogether. He ended up serving 9 years. Just 9. He was in Alcatraz, actually, which is, you will probably know, it's America's most notorious prison, sure, but still, it was a place where he was fed and housed and never once held fully accountable for what he'd done. And at the age of 32, Harvey walked out of prison a free man. And the worst part was that he was only just getting started. And of course, we now know that years later, Kathy Miller, she's gone missing, and Harvey has been looked into by the detectives in charge. And when they pulled his file, they learned about all of what had just happened. This murder conviction overturned on a technicality. He also had multiple arrests for burglary, assault, and sexual violence, which I'll talk about in a second. And worse, they spoke to his parole officer, and he told them that Harvey was explosive. He was unstable. He was a man who had beaten prison guards so savagely that he was thrown into solitary for months at a time. One note in his file said simply, "When things go wrong, Harvey becomes an animal." They were starting to learn that Harvey was a predator, and the system had just let him walk free, and now another young woman was missing, and she wouldn't be the last. So, just for a bit more info and clarity on some of those charges, and also just so we know where we're at, after Harvey got out of Alcatraz, it's not like there was any rehabilitation. He hadn't changed in the slightest. There was no reinvention, no redemption arc, just this man with a violent past, a proven volatile temper, and of course no sense of accountability. And so he drifted north to Minnesota looking for, who knows what. I think he was just moving for the sake of moving. He didn't really have anywhere to go. He actually ended up moving in with his brother Clinton, and he tried to pass himself off as just another guy trying to rebuild his life. But just 4 months after his release, Harvey and his brother Clinton, who was also a parolee from Alcatraz, were arrested for burglary in Minnesota. And this charge for burglary was also alongside a charge for assault and intent to commit rape. He wasn't just breaking into homes, he was entering people's lives with violence and control. And we have already seen this a number of times. He needs and really, really wants to have that control. Now, the court, noting his parole status and his record, did not buy his remorse. He was sentenced to 6 years and he was sent away, but he only ended up serving 4 years. It was a pattern now. Violence, then be arrested, then serve some time, and then get out again. This time, he landed in Seattle. He moved in with his mother and stepfather, and by this point it was 1967. 8 months later, Harvey was arrested again, this time for second-degree burglary. And this time the sentence was heavier. It was 15 years, maximum security. But he exhibited really good behaviour. Well done, Harv. And so he got released in just 4 years' time. So now he's 41. He's a multiple-time convicted criminal. He's never had any kind of long-term relationship. He just doesn't trust women. He doesn't like them really. But suddenly, and it shocks everyone, he gets married. The woman he marries is called Sheila Moran. She's a divorced mother with children, and she invites Harvey into her home, hoping for a fresh start. No doubt she has no idea about his previous convictions. And for a little while, it works. Harvey is helpful. He works construction during the day, he plays music at night. But amongst this, the cracks start to begin to show. He starts inviting ex-convicts over. And I'm not talking like petty thieves. He is inviting violent men, some with attempted murder charges, over to the family house. And they're turning up uninvited at Sheila's door. And Harvey kind of commandeers everything, not just her house, but also her car. He'd drive hundreds of miles without explanation. And when Sheila eventually questioned him, his temper would erupt. It was extremely scary for her and her children. And then, one day, Harvey's uncle visits from Canada. They're catching up. It's nothing like tense or out of the ordinary, but for some reason, maybe an argument or maybe just Harvey's short fuse, for some reason, he snaps. He beats his uncle to the ground. And everything kind of spirals from there. He's soon arrested again, this time for burglary and solicitation. And all this time, he is still married and living with Sheila. But Harvey's behaviour becomes impossible to ignore. She is terrified. But she does manage to leave him. And Harvey, of course, plays the victim. He tells everyone that he was just this hardworking guy. He was just trying to make ends meet, make things good for his new family. But apparently, Sheila said he didn't make enough money. Obviously, looking at what we know now, it's clear this is total BS, but that is what he told people. But Harvey knew that Sheila had left for a reason. And he knew that although he didn't accept that he'd done anything wrong, he did know that it was because of his behaviour. And so he started to try and hide who he really was, at least at first. He had learned to present himself as calm and charming and respectable, and that is how he met a woman called Alice Johnson. Alice had just come through a painful divorce, so of course at this point she is in probably one of the most vulnerable positions of her life. She's mid-30s, she's got 2 kids, she's working cleaning houses, and on her rare nights off, she would go to a local bar, and that's where she met Harvey. He started as he meant to go on, lying. He claimed he owned gas stations, that he was a self-made businessman, and Alice was, of course, impressed. She needed stability, and Harvey looked like someone who had his life together, and so he moved in with her, and with her 2 children, 11-year-old Billy and 14-year-old Georgia. And there was something else that happened here, but it's a bit tricky because, I'll just get into it and then you'll see why. So Harvey started dropping strange hints about money and power and about knowing things. And one night, he casually told Alice he had inside knowledge of a kidnapping, a big one, the Virginia Piper case. So this is the case of a millionaire's wife who was kidnapped in broad daylight. She was held for ransom in rural Minnesota, and it had been one of the biggest manhunts in the state's history. Harvey never said he did it, but the way he talked about it, the details he knew and the tone he used, it was enough to leave Alice shaken, to say the very least. But anyway, we will get back to that in a moment, but right now, we're with Alice and Harvey, and he's just moved in, and behind closed doors, Harvey's obsession wasn't with Alice, it was with her daughter. He rarely showed interest in women his own age. He had his attention fixated on teenage girls, and Georgia was right there in the house. His behaviour was disgusting. He made crude comments in public. He would often ask young waitresses if they wanted to give him a job. But the worst of it happened at home. Billy got the beatings, hard and often, and he even begged his father to take him away. And of course, Georgia wasn't left alone either. She got something almost more insidious, attention that felt really wrong. His eyes would just follow her a little too closely, and his hands would linger too long. And at first it was just that. It was just things that felt a bit off, that made her uncomfortable. But then one night, Harvey asked her to go for a drive, just the 2 of them. She didn't want to, but she couldn't really find a way to say no. And in the car, he reached for her thigh. She froze and then begged him to stop. He told her it was nothing, and he did stop, this time. But at home, he stared at her constantly, invasive and silent. Like the way it's described, it is so creepy. She's living with this 24/7 under her own roof. Then, one afternoon, with no warning, he picked her up. He carried her towards the bedroom, and Georgia screamed and she fought and she begged him to let her go. And somehow he actually did. And this was it for Georgia. She ran away soon after that. She ran straight to her biological father and she never went back. And Alice's life by this point was bad. She had become completely isolated and exhausted and trapped. The abuse had only escalated. One night, Harvey hit her so hard she flew across the room, and she split her lip so badly that it took 5 stitches to close. She blamed herself, though, saying she shouldn't have nagged him and thinking that she was being too loud or whatever. Like so many women, and we see this time and time again on REDRUM, she really internalised that violence and she was ashamed. And meanwhile, at this time, Harvey was now the prime suspect in Kathy Miller's disappearance, so that is all still ongoing. We know that Alice's daughter Georgia has left home by this point. She's gone to live with her dad, and one day, she picked up the phone and called Kathy Miller's mother, Mary. She was calling to warn her about Harvey. He had also, as we know, been questioned by police, but he denied knowing Kathy. So I think that's probably how Georgia had made that link and then got in touch with Alice. So police said to Harvey, fine, we understand that you don't know her, that's what you're saying, but we want a polygraph. But Harvey lawyered up. It seemed he'd grown kind of nervous for the first time. And all this time, Alice's own suspicions deepened. Harvey demanded she vacuum his truck meticulously, and it got her thinking, what was he trying to hide? And the beatings got worse too, but one day, thankfully, she managed to find the strength and means to be able to leave him, especially after other women started sharing stories of Harvey's creepy behaviour, offering cars for sex, inviting women late at night to the petrol station, just generally being a creep. The investigation into Kathy's disappearance continued on, and the police began connecting the dots of other disappearances in the area. One name kept resurfacing during the investigation, a 19-year-old woman named Leslie Laura Brock. And her story, it really hit Mary Miller because months before Kathy disappeared, Mary had read about Leslie's murder in the paper. She remembered it really vividly because it was this young woman hitchhiking and then she was brutally killed. And she remembered sitting Kathy down and warning her, don't you ever accept a ride from a stranger, not ever. Leslie had been found bludgeoned to death, her entire left side crushed so violently that medical examiners struggled to determine just how many blows had been landed. Whatever had been used, fists, a hammer, maybe even a rock, it had been used with unrelenting rage. And for what? For what, refusing a man like Harvey? And then came the moment no mother ever wants to imagine. 2 teenage boys were out on their dirt bikes, skimming the edge of this reservation. It had thick brush, uneven trails. It's the kind of wild overgrowth that hides pretty much everything. They were out picking berries, or at least trying to, when this smell hit them. Not a normal forest smell, not even dead animals or like wet moss, but it was something pungent, human. And me and my friend Tom were talking about this the other day. That smell of death, the one everyone, all medical examiners, detectives, anyone who's featured on these kinds of programs, they talk about it. They say it's like the unmistakable stench of death. I, fortunately, have never had to deal with that. I've never known what that is, but I am curious. Apparently it's unmistakable. I just can't imagine what it is. But anyway, these teenagers, they got that smell. And at first they thought maybe it's a large animal carcass, but curiosity pulled them deeper into this overgrowth, and that's when they saw it. A shape. Wrapped in black plastic, almost mummified, lying in a twisted, unnatural heap. Panicked, they turned their bikes around and rode straight to the sheriff's station just 2 miles down the road, and what investigators found was horrifying. Inside that plastic was the body of a young woman, posed like she was almost peacefully sleeping, one hand tucked beneath her chin, just like she drifted off. But on closer examination, it was clear that there were 2 bullets in her head. Her skull had also been caved in, and a cheekbone was shattered. Her clothes were completely torn, and they knew as well that this woman, this victim, she hadn't died here, that was clear. She had been dumped. The body was soon identified as Kathy Miller. And suddenly, everything Mary feared came crashing into reality. For all this time, Mary had obviously clung on to the hope that Kathy was just missing, that maybe she had run away, as unlikely as that was. Maybe she was hiding. Maybe she was out there, somehow, somewhere, still alive. But now, those fragile thoughts, the reality hit, and she knew what had actually happened. She collapsed when they told her. Literally, her knees buckled beneath her and she crumpled to the floor, wailing. A sound that officers at the scene would later say they would never forget. It wasn't screaming or sobbing, it was just this long, broken moan that came from a place so deep inside of her, it didn't even sound human. If you've ever had the unfortunate misfortune of hearing that, you will know it is guttural and it is so pure and devastating. Mary's daughter, the little girl she'd raised, her Kathy, was gone. And the worst part was that she had known. She'd known something was wrong. She'd warned her, she'd had that dream all those years ago. And she had even begged her not to hitchhike, not to trust strangers. And still, somehow, this monster had gotten to her, managed to penetrate the warnings and the gut instinct. And now Kathy's body was lying cold in the morgue and the man responsible was still out there somewhere. But this wasn't just a murder. It was the beginning of a pattern. And the man responsible was not finished, not even close. This is the end of part 1. The next part is up right now and available to listen to in the REDRUM feed. So I will see you over there in a couple of minutes. Bye.